U.S. History, an OpenStax textbook. Read along with the full text at www.openstax.org. You can find this audiobook anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and more. Chapter 23, Americans and the Great War, 1914 to 1919.
Introduction.
On the eve of World War I, the U.S. government under President Woodrow Wilson opposed any entanglement in international military conflicts. But as the war engulfed Europe and the belligerents' total war strategies targeted commerce and travel across the Atlantic, it became clear that the United States would not be able to maintain its position of neutrality. Still, the American public was of mixed opinion. Many resisted the idea of American intervention and American lives lost, no matter how bad the circumstances. In 1918, artist George Bellows created a series of paintings intended to strengthen public support for the war effort. His paintings depicted German war atrocities in explicit and expertly captured detail, from children run through with bayonets to torturers happily resting while their victims suffered. The image above, entitled Return of the Useless, shows Germans unloading sick or disabled labor camp prisoners from a boxcar. These paintings, while not regarded as Bellows' most important artistic work, were typical for anti-German propaganda at the time. The U.S. government sponsored much of this propaganda out of concern that many American immigrants sympathized with the Central Powers and would not support the U.S. war effort.
(23.1) American Isolationism and the European Origins of War. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy and the difficulties of maintaining American neutrality at the outset of World War I. Identify the key factors that led to the U.S. declaration of war on Germany in April 1917.
Unlike his immediate predecessors, President Woodrow Wilson had planned to shrink the role of the United States in foreign affairs. He believed that the nation needed to intervene in international events only when there was a moral imperative to do so. But as Europe's political situation grew dire, it became increasingly difficult for Wilson to insist that the conflict growing overseas was not America's responsibility. Germany's war tactics struck most observers as morally reprehensible, while also putting American free trade with the Entente at risk. Despite campaign promises and diplomatic efforts, Wilson could only postpone American involvement in the war. Woodrow Wilson's early efforts at foreign policy. When Woodrow Wilson took over the White House in March 1913, he promised a less expansionist approach to American foreign policy than Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft had pursued. Wilson did share the commonly held view that American values were superior to those of the rest of the world, that democracy was the best system to promote peace and stability, and that the United States should continue to actively pursue economic markets abroad. But he proposed an idealistic foreign policy based on morality, rather than American self-interest, and felt that American interference in another nation's affairs should occur only when the circumstances rose to the level of a moral imperative. Wilson appointed former presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, a noted anti-imperialist and proponent of world peace, as his Secretary of State. Bryan undertook his new assignment with great vigor, encouraging nations around the world to sign cooling-off treaties, under which they agreed to resolve international disputes through talks, not war, and to submit any grievances to an international commission. Bryan also negotiated friendly relations with Colombia, including a $25 million apology for Roosevelt's actions during the Panamanian Revolution, and worked to establish effective self-government in the Philippines in preparation for the eventual American withdrawal. Even with Bryan's support, however, Wilson found that it was much harder than he anticipated to keep the United States out of world affairs. In reality, the United States was interventionist in areas where its interests, direct or indirect, were threatened. Wilson's greatest break from his predecessors occurred in Asia, where he abandoned Taft's dollar diplomacy, a foreign policy that essentially used the power of U.S. economic dominance as a threat to gain favorable terms. Instead, Wilson revived diplomatic efforts to keep Japanese interference there at a minimum. But as World War I, also known as the Great War, began to unfold, and European nations largely abandoned their imperialistic interests in order to marshal their forces for self-defense, Japan demanded that China succumb to a Japanese protectorate over their entire nation. In 1917, William Jennings Bryan's successor as Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, signed the Lansing-Ishii Agreement, which recognized Japanese control over the Manchurian region of China in exchange for Japan's promise not to exploit the war to gain a greater foothold in the rest of the country. Furthering his goal of reducing overseas interventions, Wilson had promised not to rely on the Roosevelt corollary, Theodore Roosevelt's explicit policy that the United States could involve itself in Latin American politics whenever it felt that the countries in the Western Hemisphere needed policing. Once president, however, Wilson again found that it was more difficult to avoid American interventionism in practice than in rhetoric. Indeed, Wilson intervened more in Western Hemisphere affairs than either Taft or Roosevelt. In 1915, when a revolution in Haiti resulted in the murder of the Haitian president and threatened the safety of New York banking interests in the country, Wilson sent over 300 U.S. Marines to establish order. Subsequently, the United States assumed control over the island's foreign policy as well as its financial administration. 1 year later, in 1916, Wilson again sent Marines to Hispaniola, this time to the Dominican Republic, to ensure prompt payment of a debt that nation owed. In 1917, Wilson sent troops to Cuba to protect American-owned sugar plantations from attacks by Cuban rebels. This time, the troops remained for 4 years. Wilson's most noted foreign policy foray prior to World War I focused on Mexico, where rebel General Victoriano Huerta had seized control from a previous rebel government just weeks before Wilson's inauguration. Wilson refused to recognize Huerta's government, instead choosing to make an example of Mexico by demanding that they hold democratic elections and establish laws based on the moral principles he espoused. Officially, Wilson supported Venustiano Carranza, who opposed Huerta's military control of the country. When American intelligence learned of a German ship allegedly preparing to deliver weapons to Huerta's forces, Wilson ordered the U.S. Navy to land forces at Veracruz to stop the shipment. On April 22, 1914, a fight erupted between the U.S. Navy and Mexican troops, resulting in nearly 150 deaths, 19 of them American. Although Carranza's faction managed to overthrow Huerta in the summer of 1914, most Mexicans, including Carranza, had come to resent American intervention in their affairs. Carranza refused to work with Wilson and the U.S. government, and instead threatened to defend Mexico's mineral rights against all American oil companies established there. Wilson then turned to support rebel forces who opposed Carranza, most notably Pancho Villa. However, Villa lacked the strength in number or weapons to overtake Carranza. In 1915, Wilson reluctantly authorized official U.S. recognition of Carranza's government. As a postscript, an irate Pancho Villa turned against Wilson, and on March 9, 1916, led a 1,500-man force across the border into New Mexico, where they attacked and burned the town of Columbus. Over 100 people died in the attack, 17 of them American. Wilson responded by sending General John Pershing into Mexico to capture Villa and return him to the United States for trial. With over 11,000 troops at his disposal, Pershing marched 300 miles into Mexico before an angry Carranza ordered U.S. troops to withdraw from the nation. Although re-elected in 1916, Wilson reluctantly ordered the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Mexico in 1917, avoiding war with Mexico and enabling preparations for American intervention in Europe. Again, as in China, Wilson's attempt to impose a moral foreign policy had failed in light of economic and political realities. War erupts in Europe. When a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, murdered the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire on June 28, 1914, the underlying forces that led to World War I had already long been in motion and seemed at first to have little to do with the United States. At the time, the events that pushed Europe from ongoing tensions into war seemed very far away from U.S. interests. For nearly a century, European nations had negotiated a series of alliance treaties to secure themselves against their rivals. The two main alliances that existed in Europe before the outbreak of World War I were the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. The former bound France, Great Britain, and Russia into a moral obligation to defend each other in case of war. The latter was a stricter mutual defense alliance that included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. With the outbreak of war, these alliances transformed into the two opposing sides in the conflict. The Triple Alliance became the Central Powers and added the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. Italy declared neutrality and eventually joined the opposing side, the Allied Powers, which formed around the rump of the Triple Entente, and over the course of the war, added additional major countries like the United States and Japan. A series of side treaties likewise entangled the larger European powers to protect several smaller ones should war break out. At the same time that European nations committed each other to defense pacts, they jockeyed for power over empires overseas and invested heavily in large modern militaries. Dreams of empire and military supremacy fueled an era of nationalism that was particularly pronounced in the newer nations of Germany and Italy. Some in Serbia were also swept up in the nationalist fervor of the age and sought to extend Serbia's territorial claims over all ethnic Serbs in southeastern Europe. In 1914, a group of these Serbian nationalists assassinated the Austro-Hungarian Archduke as part of their fight to achieve this goal. After the assassination, Austria-Hungary pointed the finger at Serbia and issued a list of harsh demands. When Serbia failed to accede to Austro-Hungarian demands, in the wake of the Archduke's murder, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia with the confidence that it had the backing of Germany. This action, in turn, brought Russia into the conflict, due to a treaty in which they had agreed to defend Serbia. Germany followed suit by declaring war on Russia, fearing that Russia and France would seize this opportunity to move on Germany if it did not take the offensive. The eventual German invasion of Belgium drew Great Britain into the war, followed by the attack of the Ottoman Empire on Russia. By the end of August 1914, it seemed as if Europe had dragged the entire world into war. The Great War was unlike any war that came before it. Whereas in previous European conflicts, troops typically faced each other on open battlefields, World War I saw new military technologies that turned war into a conflict of prolonged trench warfare. Both sides used new artillery, tanks, airplanes, machine guns, barbed wire, and, eventually, poison gas. Weapons that strengthened defenses and turned each military offense into barbarous sacrifices of thousands of lives with minimal territorial advances in return. By the end of the war, the total military death toll was 10 million, as well as another million civilian deaths attributed to military action, and another 6 million civilian deaths caused by famine, disease, or other related factors. One terrifying new piece of technological warfare was the German Unterseeboot, an undersea boat or U-boat. By early 1915, in an effort to break the British naval blockade of Germany and turn the tide of the war, the Germans dispatched a fleet of these submarines around Great Britain to attack both merchant and military ships. The U-boats acted in direct violation of international law, attacking without warning from beneath the water, instead of surfacing and permitting the surrender of civilians or crew. By 1918, German U-boats had sunk nearly 5,000 vessels. Of greatest historical note was the attack on the British passenger ship RMS Lusitania on its way from New York to Liverpool on May 7, 1915. The German embassy in the United States had announced that this ship would be subject to attack for its cargo of ammunition, an allegation that later proved accurate. Nonetheless, almost 1,200 civilians died in the attack, including 128 Americans. The attack horrified the world, galvanizing support in England and beyond for the war. This attack, more than any other event, would test President Wilson's desire to stay out of what had been a largely European conflict. The challenge of neutrality. Despite the loss of American lives on the Lusitania, President Wilson stuck to his path of neutrality in Europe's escalating war. In part out of moral principle, in part as a matter of practical necessity, and in part for political reasons. Few Americans wished to participate in the devastating battles that ravaged Europe, and Wilson did not want to risk losing his re-election by ordering an unpopular military intervention. Wilson's neutrality did not mean isolation from all warring factions, but rather open markets for the United States and continued commercial ties with all belligerents. For Wilson, the conflict did not reach the threshold of a moral imperative for U.S. involvement. It was largely a European affair involving numerous countries with whom the United States wished to maintain working relations. In his message to Congress in 1914, the president noted that every man who really loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality, which is the spirit of impartiality and fairness and friendliness to all concerned. Wilson understood that he was already looking at a difficult re-election bid. He had only won the 1912 election with 42% of the popular vote, and likely would not have been elected at all had Roosevelt not come back as a third-party candidate to run against his former protege Taft. Wilson felt pressure from all different political constituents to take a position on the war. Yet he knew that elections were seldom won with a campaign promise of, if elected, I will send your sons to war. Facing pressure from some businessmen and other government officials who felt that the protection of America's best interests required a stronger position in defense of the Allied forces, Wilson agreed to a preparedness campaign in the year prior to the election. This campaign included the passage of the National Defense Act of 1916, which more than doubled the size of the Army to nearly 225,000, and the Naval Appropriations Act of 1916, which called for the expansion of the U.S. fleet, including battleships, destroyers, submarines, and other ships. As the 1916 election approached, the Republican Party hoped to capitalize on the fact that Wilson was making promises that he would not be able to keep. They nominated Charles Evans Hughes, a former governor of New York and sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice at the time of his nomination. Hughes focused his campaign on what he considered Wilson's foreign policy failures, but even as he did so, he himself tried to walk a fine line between neutrality and belligerence depending on his audience. In contrast, Wilson and the Democrats capitalized on neutrality and campaigned under the slogan, "Wilson, he kept us out of war." The election itself remained too close to call on election night. Only when a tight race in California was decided 2 days later could Wilson claim victory in his re-election bid, again with less than 50% of the popular vote. Despite his victory based upon a policy of neutrality, Wilson would find true neutrality a difficult challenge. Several different factors pushed Wilson, however reluctantly, toward the inevitability of American involvement. A key factor driving U.S. engagement was economics. Great Britain was the country's most important trading partner, and the Allies as a whole relied heavily on American imports from the earliest days of the war forward. Specifically, the value of all exports to the Allies quadrupled from $750 million to $3 billion in the first 2 years of the war. At the same time, the British naval blockade meant that exports to Germany all but ended, dropping from $350 million to $30 million. Likewise, numerous private banks in the United States made extensive loans, in excess of $500 million, to England. J.P. Morgan's banking interests were among the largest lenders, due to his family's connection to the country. Another key factor complicating the decision to go to war was the deep ethnic divisions between native-born Americans and more recent immigrants. For those of Anglo-Saxon descent, the nation's historic and ongoing relationship with Great Britain was paramount, but many Irish Americans resented British rule over their place of birth and opposed support for the world's most expansive empire. Millions of Jewish immigrants had fled anti-Semitic pogroms in Tsarist Russia and would have supported any nation fighting that authoritarian state. German Americans saw their nation of origin as a victim of British and Russian aggression and a French desire to settle old scores, whereas immigrants from Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were mixed in their sympathies for the old monarchies or ethnic communities that these empires suppressed. For interventionists, this lack of support for Great Britain and its allies among recent immigrants only strengthened their conviction. Germany's use of submarine warfare also played a role in challenging U.S. neutrality. After the sinking of the Lusitania and the subsequent August 30th sinking of another British liner, the Arabic Germany had promised to restrict their use of submarine warfare. Specifically, they promised to surface and visually identify any ship before they fired, as well as permit civilians to evacuate targeted ships. Instead, in February 1917, Germany intensified their use of submarines in an effort to end the war quickly before Great Britain's naval blockade starved them out of food and supplies. The German High Command wanted to continue unrestricted warfare on all Atlantic traffic, including unarmed American freighters, in order to devastate the British economy and secure a quick and decisive victory. Their goal: to bring an end to the war before the United States could intervene and tip the balance in this grueling war of attrition. In February 1917, a German U-boat sank the American merchant ship, the Laconia, killing 2 passengers, and, in late March, quickly sunk 4 more American ships. These attacks increased pressure on Wilson from all sides, as government officials, the general public, and both Democrats and Republicans urged him to declare war. The final element that led to American involvement in World War I was the so-called Zimmermann telegram. British intelligence intercepted and decoded a top-secret telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador to Mexico, instructing the latter to invite Mexico to join the war effort on the German side should the United States declare war on Germany. It further went on to encourage Mexico to invade the United States if such a declaration came to pass, as Mexico's invasion would create a diversion and permit Germany a clear path to victory. In exchange, Zimmermann offered to return to Mexico land that was previously lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War, including Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. The likelihood that Mexico, weakened and torn by its own revolution and civil war, could wage war against the United States and recover territory lost in the Mexican-American War with Germany's help was remote at best. But combined with Germany's unrestricted use of submarine warfare and the sinking of American ships, the Zimmermann telegram made a powerful argument for a declaration of war. The outbreak of the Russian Revolution in February and abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in March raised the prospect of democracy in the Eurasian Empire and removed an important moral objection to entering the war on the side of the Allies. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Congress debated for 4 days, and several senators and congressmen expressed their concerns that the war was being fought over U.S. economic interests more than strategic need or democratic ideals. When Congress voted on April 6, 56 voted against the resolution, including the first woman ever elected to Congress, Representative Jeannette Rankin. This was the largest no vote against a war resolution in American history.
Defining American. Wilson's peace without victory speech. Wilson's last-ditch effort to avoid bringing the United States into World War I is captured in a speech he gave before the U.S. Senate on January 22, 1917. This speech, known as the Peace Without Victory speech, extolled the country to be patient, as the countries involved in the war were nearing a peace. Wilson stated,
"It must be a peace without victory. It is not pleasant to say this. I beg that I may be permitted to put my own interpretation upon it, and that it may be understood that no other interpretation was in my thought. I am seeking only to face realities and to face them without soft concealments. Victory would mean peace forced upon the loser, a victor's terms imposed upon the vanquished. It would be accepted in humiliation under duress, at an intolerable sacrifice, and would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory upon which terms of peace would rest, not permanently but only as upon quicksand. Only a peace between equals can last, only a peace the very principle of which is equality, and a common participation in a common benefit."
Not surprisingly, this speech was not well received by either side fighting the war. England resisted being put on the same moral ground as Germany, and France, whose country had been battered by years of warfare, had no desire to end the war without victory and its spoils. Still, the speech as a whole illustrates Wilson's idealistic, if failed, attempt to create a more benign and high-minded foreign policy role for the United States. Unfortunately, the Zimmermann telegram and the sinking of the American merchant ships proved too provocative for Wilson to remain neutral. Little more than 2 months after this speech, he asked Congress to declare war on Germany. (23.2) The United States prepares for war. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the steps taken by the U.S. government to secure enough men, money, food, and supplies to prosecute World War I. Explain how the U.S. government attempted to sway popular opinion in favor of the war effort.
Wilson knew that the key to America's success in war lay largely in its preparation. With both the Allied and enemy forces entrenched in battles of attrition and supplies running low on both sides, the United States needed, first and foremost, to secure enough men, money, food, and supplies to be successful. The country needed to first supply the basic requirements to fight a war and then work to ensure military leadership, public support, and strategic planning. The ingredients of war. The First World War was, in many ways, a war of attrition, and the United States needed a large army to help the Allies. In 1917, when the United States declared war on Germany, the U.S. Army ranked 7th in the world in terms of size, with an estimated 200,000 enlisted men. In contrast, at the outset of the war in 1914, the German force included 4.5 million men, and the country ultimately mobilized over 11 million soldiers over the course of the entire war. To compose a fighting force, Congress passed the Selective Service Act in 1917, which initially required all men aged 21 through 30 to register for the draft. In 1918, the act was expanded to include all men between 18 and 45. Through a campaign of patriotic appeals, as well as an administrative system that allowed men to register at their local draft boards, rather than directly with the federal government, over 10 million men registered for the draft on the very first day. By the war's end, 22 million men had registered for the U.S. Army draft. 5 million of these men were actually drafted, another 1.5 million volunteered, and over 500,000 additional men signed up for the Navy or Marines. In all, 2 million men participated in combat operations overseas. Among the volunteers were also 20,000 women, a quarter of whom went to France to serve as nurses or in clerical positions. But the draft also provoked opposition, and almost 350,000 eligible Americans refused to register for military service. About 65,000 of these defied the conscription law as conscientious objectors, mostly on the grounds of their deeply held religious beliefs. Such opposition was not without risks, and whereas most objectors were never prosecuted, those who were found guilty at military hearings received stiff punishments. Courts handed down over 200 prison sentences of 20 years or more and 17 death sentences. With the size of the Army growing, the U.S. government next needed to ensure that there were adequate supplies, in particular food and fuel, for both the soldiers and the home front. Concerns over shortages led to the passage of the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act, which empowered the president to control the production, distribution, and price of all food products during the war effort. Using this law, Wilson created both a fuel administration and a food administration. The fuel administration, run by Harry Garfield, created the concept of fuel holidays, encouraging civilian Americans to do their part for the war effort by rationing fuel on certain days. Garfield also implemented daylight saving time for the first time in American history, shifting the clocks to allow more productive daylight hours. Herbert Hoover coordinated the food administration, and he too encouraged volunteer rationing by invoking patriotism. With the slogan, "Food will win the war," Hoover encouraged meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and other similar reductions, with the hope of rationing food for military use. Wilson also created the War Industries Board, run by Bernard Baruch, to ensure adequate military supplies. The War Industries Board had the power to direct shipments of raw materials, as well as to control government contracts with private producers. Baruch used lucrative contracts with guaranteed profits to encourage several private firms to shift their production over to wartime materials. For those firms that refused to cooperate, Baruch's government control over raw materials provided him with the necessary leverage to convince them to join the war effort, willingly or not. As a way to move all the personnel and supplies around the country efficiently, Congress created the U.S. Railroad Administration. Logistical problems had led trains bound for the East Coast to get stranded as far away as Chicago. To prevent these problems, Wilson appointed William McAdoo, the Secretary of the Treasury, to lead this agency, which had extraordinary war powers to control the entire railroad industry, including traffic, terminals, rates, and wages. Almost all the practical steps were in place for the United States to fight a successful war. The only step remaining was to figure out how to pay for it. The war effort was costly, with an eventual price tag in excess of $32 billion by 1920, and the government needed to finance it. The Liberty Loan Act allowed the federal government to sell Liberty bonds to the American public, extolling citizens to do their part to help the war effort and bring the troops home. The government ultimately raised $23 billion through Liberty bonds. Additional monies came from the government's use of federal income tax revenue, which was made possible by the passage of the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1913. With the financing, transportation, equipment, food, and men in place, the United States was ready to enter the war. The next piece the country needed was public support. Controlling dissent. Although all the physical pieces required to fight a war fell quickly into place, the question of national unity was another concern. The American public was strongly divided on the subject of entering the war. While many felt it was the only choice, others protested strongly, feeling it was not America's war to fight. Wilson needed to ensure that a nation of diverse immigrants with ties to both sides of the conflict thought of themselves as American first and their home country's nationality second. To do this, he initiated a propaganda campaign, pushing the America First message, which sought to convince Americans that they should do everything in their power to ensure an American victory, even if that meant silencing their own criticisms. The Wilson administration created the Committee of Public Information under Director George Creel, a former journalist, just days after the United States declared war on Germany. Creel employed artists, speakers, writers, and filmmakers to develop a propaganda machine. The goal was to encourage all Americans to make sacrifices during the war and, equally importantly, to hate all things German. Through efforts such as the establishment of loyalty leagues in ethnic immigrant communities, Creel largely succeeded in molding an anti-German sentiment around the country. The result? Some schools banned the teaching of the German language, and some restaurants refused to serve frankfurters, sauerkraut, or hamburgers, instead serving Liberty dogs with Liberty cabbage and Liberty sandwiches. Symphonies refused to perform music written by German composers. The hatred of Germans grew so widespread that at one point at a circus, audience members cheered when, in an act gone horribly wrong, a Russian bear mauled a German animal trainer, whose ethnicity was more a part of the act than reality. In addition to its propaganda campaign, the U.S. government also tried to secure broad support for the war effort with repressive legislation. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 prohibited individual trade with an enemy nation and banned the use of the Postal Service for disseminating any literature deemed treasonous by the Postmaster General. That same year, the Espionage Act prohibited giving aid to the enemy by spying or espionage, as well as any public comments that opposed the American war effort. Under this act, the government could impose fines and imprisonment of up to 20 years. The Sedition Act, passed in 1918, prohibited any criticism or disloyal language against the federal government and its policies, the U.S. Constitution, the military uniform, or the American flag. More than 2,000 persons were charged with violating these laws, and many received prison sentences of up to 20 years. Immigrants faced deportation as punishment for their dissent. Not since the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 had the federal government so infringed on the freedom of speech of loyal American citizens. In the months and years after these laws came into being, over 1,000 people were convicted for their violation, primarily under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. More importantly, many more war critics were frightened into silence. One notable prosecution was that of Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs, who received a 10-year prison sentence for encouraging draft resistance, which under the Espionage Act was considered giving aid to the enemy. Prominent socialist Victor Berger was also prosecuted under the Espionage Act and subsequently twice denied his seat in Congress, to which he had been properly elected by the citizens of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. One of the more outrageous prosecutions was that of a film producer who released a film about the American Revolution. Prosecutors found the film seditious, and a court convicted the producer to 10 years in prison for portraying the British, who were now American allies, as the obedient soldiers of a monarchical empire. State and local officials, as well as private citizens, aided the government's efforts to investigate, identify, and crush subversion. Over 180,000 communities created local councils of defense, which encouraged members to report any anti-war comments to local authorities. This mandate encouraged spying on neighbors, teachers, local newspapers, and other individuals. In addition, a larger national organization, the American Protective League, received support from the Department of Justice to spy on prominent dissenters, as well as open their mail and physically assault draft evaders. Understandably, opposition to such repression began mounting. In 1917, Roger Baldwin formed the National Civil Liberties Bureau, a forerunner to the American Civil Liberties Union, which was founded in 1920, to challenge the government's policies against wartime dissent and conscientious objection. In 1919, the case of Schenck v. United States went to the U.S. Supreme Court to challenge the constitutionality of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The case concerned Charles Schenck, a leader in the Socialist Party of Philadelphia, who had distributed 15,000 leaflets encouraging young men to avoid conscription. The court ruled that during a time of war, the federal government was justified in passing such laws to quiet dissenters. The decision was unanimous, and in the court's opinion, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that such dissent presented a clear and present danger to the safety of the United States and the military and was therefore justified. He further explained how the First Amendment right of free speech did not protect such dissent, in the same manner that a citizen could not be freely permitted to yell "fire" in a crowded theater due to the danger it presented. Congress ultimately repealed most of the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1921, and several who were imprisoned for violation of those acts were then quickly released. But the Supreme Court's deference to the federal government's restrictions on civil liberties remained a volatile topic in future wars.
Americana. American first. American above all. At the outset of the war, one of the greatest challenges for Wilson was the lack of national unity. The country, after all, was made up of immigrants, some recently arrived and some well-established, but all with ties to their home countries. These home countries included Germany and Russia, as well as Great Britain and France. In an effort to ensure that Americans eventually supported the war, the government pro-war propaganda campaign focused on driving home that message. The posters below, shown in both English and Yiddish, prompted immigrants to remember what they owed to America. Regardless of how patriotic immigrants might feel and act, however, an anti-German xenophobia overtook the country. German Americans were persecuted and their businesses shunned, whether or not they voiced any objection to the war. Some cities changed the names of the streets and buildings if they were German. Libraries withdrew German-language books from the shelves, and German Americans began to avoid speaking German for fear of reprisal. For some immigrants, the war was fought on two fronts, on the battlefields of France and again at home. A new home front. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain how the status of organized labor changed during the First World War. Describe how the lives of women and African Americans changed as a result of American participation in World War I. Explain how America's participation in World War I allowed for the passage of prohibition and women's suffrage.
The lives of all Americans, whether they went abroad to fight or stayed on the home front, changed dramatically during the war. Restrictive laws censored dissent at home, and the armed forces demanded unconditional loyalty from millions of volunteers and conscripted soldiers. For organized labor, women, and African Americans in particular, the war brought changes to the pre-war status quo. Some white women worked outside of the home for the first time, whereas others, like African American men, found that they were eligible for jobs that had previously been reserved for white men. African American women, too, were able to seek employment beyond the domestic servant jobs that had been their primary opportunity. These new options and freedoms were not easily erased after the war ended. New opportunities born from war. After decades of limited involvement in the challenges between management and organized labor, the need for peaceful and productive industrial relations prompted the federal government during wartime to invite organized labor to the negotiating table. Samuel Gompers, head of the American Federation of Labor, AFL, sought to capitalize on these circumstances to better organize workers and secure for them better wages and working conditions. His efforts also solidified his own base of power. The increase in production that the war required exposed severe labor shortages in many states, a condition that was further exacerbated by the draft, which pulled millions of young men from the active labor force. Wilson only briefly investigated the long-standing animosity between labor and management before ordering the creation of the National Labor War Board in April 1918. Quick negotiations with Gompers and the AFL resulted in a promise. Organized labor would make a no-strike pledge for the duration of the war in exchange for the U.S. government's protection of workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively. The federal government kept its promise and promoted the adoption of an 8-hour workday, which had first been adopted by government employees in 1868. A living wage for all workers and union membership. As a result, union membership skyrocketed during the war, from 2.6 million members in 1916 to 4.1 million in 1919. In short, American workers received better working conditions and wages as a result of the country's participation in the war. However, their economic gains were limited. While prosperity overall went up during the war, it was enjoyed more by business owners and corporations than by the workers themselves. Even though wages increased, inflation offset most of the gains. Prices in the United States increased an average of 15 to 20% annually between 1917 and 1920. Individual purchasing power actually declined during the war due to the substantially higher cost of living. Business profits, in contrast, increased by nearly a third during the war. Women in wartime. For women, the economic situation was complicated by the war, with the departure of wage-earning men and the higher cost of living pushing many toward less comfortable lives. At the same time, however, wartime presented new opportunities for women in the workplace. More than 1 million women entered the workforce for the first time as a result of the war, while more than 8 million working women found higher-paying jobs, often in industry. Many women also found employment in what were typically considered male occupations, such as on the railroads, where the number of women tripled, and on assembly lines. After the war ended and men returned home and searched for work, women were fired from their jobs and expected to return home and care for their families. Furthermore, even when they were doing men's jobs, women were typically paid lower wages than male workers, and unions were ambivalent at best and hostile at worst to women workers. Even under these circumstances, wartime employment familiarized women with an alternative to a life in domesticity and dependency, making a life of employment, even a career, plausible for women. When, a generation later, World War II arrived, this trend would increase dramatically. One notable group of women who exploited these new opportunities was the Women's Land Army of America. First during World War I, then again in World War II, these women stepped up to run farms and other agricultural enterprises as men left for the armed forces. Known as farmerettes, some 20,000 women, mostly college-educated and from larger urban areas, served in this capacity. Their reasons for joining were manifold. For some, it was a way to serve their country during a time of war. Others hoped to capitalize on the efforts to further the fight for women's suffrage. Also of special note were the approximately 30,000 American women who served in the military, as well as a variety of humanitarian organizations, such as the Red Cross and YMCA during the war. In addition to serving as military nurses, without rank, American women also served as telephone operators in France. Of this latter group, 230 of them, known as Hello Girls, were bilingual and stationed in combat areas. Over 18,000 American women served as Red Cross nurses, providing much of the medical support available to American troops in France. Close to 300 nurses died during service. Many of those who returned home continued to work in hospitals and home health care, helping wounded veterans heal both emotionally and physically from the scars of war. African Americans in the crusade for democracy. African Americans also found that the war brought upheaval and opportunity. Black people composed 13% of the enlisted military, with 350,000 men serving. Colonel Charles Young of the 10th Cavalry Division served as the highest-ranking African American officer. Black people served in segregated units and suffered from widespread racism in the military hierarchy, often serving in menial or support roles. Some troops saw combat, however, and were commended for serving with valor. The 369th Infantry, for example, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, served on the front line of France for 6 months, longer than any other American unit. 171 men from that regiment received the Legion of Merit for meritorious service in combat. The regiment marched in a homecoming parade in New York City, was remembered in paintings, and was celebrated for bravery and leadership. The accolades given to them, however, in no way extended to the bulk of African Americans fighting in the war. On the home front, African Americans, like American women, saw economic opportunities increase during the war. During the so-called Great Migration, discussed in a previous chapter, nearly 350,000 African Americans had fled the post-Civil War South for opportunities in northern urban areas. From 1910 to 1920, they moved north and found work in the steel, mining, shipbuilding, and automotive industries, among others. African American women also sought better employment opportunities beyond their traditional roles as domestic servants. By 1920, over 100,000 women had found work in diverse manufacturing industries, up from 70,000 in 1910. Despite these opportunities, racism continued to be a major force in both the North and South. Worried that black veterans would feel empowered to change the status quo of white supremacy, many white people took political, economic, and violent action against them. In a speech on the Senate floor in 1917, Mississippi Senator James K. Vardaman said, "Impress the Negro with the fact that he is defending the flag, inflate his untutored soul with military airs, teach him that it is his duty to keep the emblem of the nation flying triumphantly in the air. It is but a short step to the conclusion that his political rights must be respected." Several municipalities passed residential codes designed to prohibit African Americans from settling in certain neighborhoods. Race riots also increased in frequency. In 1917 alone, there were race riots in 25 cities, including East St. Louis, where 39 black people were killed. In the South, white business and plantation owners feared that their cheap workforce was fleeing the region, and used violence to intimidate black people into staying. According to NAACP statistics, recorded incidences of lynching increased from 38 in 1917 to 83 in 1919. Dozens of black veterans were among the victims. The frequency of these killings did not start to decrease until 1923, when the number of annual lynchings dropped below 35 for the first time since the Civil War. The last vestiges of progressivism. Across the United States, the war intersected with the last lingering efforts of the progressives who sought to use the war as motivation for their final push for change. It was in large part due to the war's influence that progressives were able to lobby for the passage of the 18th and 19th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The 18th Amendment, prohibiting alcohol, and the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, received their final impetus due to the war effort. Prohibition, as the anti-alcohol movement became known, had been a goal of many progressives for decades. Organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League linked alcohol consumption with any number of societal problems, and they had worked tirelessly with municipalities and counties to limit or prohibit alcohol on a local scale. But with the war, prohibitionists saw an opportunity for federal action. One factor that helped their cause was the strong anti-German sentiment that gripped the country, which turned sympathy away from the largely German-descended immigrants who ran the breweries. Furthermore, the public cry to ration food and grain, the latter being a key ingredient in both beer and hard alcohol, made prohibition even more patriotic. Congress ratified the 18th Amendment in January 1919, with provisions to take effect 1 year later. Specifically, the amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. It did not prohibit the drinking of alcohol, as there was a widespread feeling that such language would be viewed as too intrusive on personal rights. However, by eliminating the manufacture, sale, and transport of such beverages, drinking was effectively outlawed. Shortly thereafter, Congress passed the Volstead Act, translating the 18th Amendment into an enforceable ban on the consumption of alcoholic beverages, and regulating the scientific and industrial uses of alcohol. The act also specifically excluded from prohibition the use of alcohol for religious rituals. Unfortunately for proponents of the amendment, the ban on alcohol did not take effect until 1 full year following the end of the war. Almost immediately following the war, the general public began to oppose and clearly violate the law, making it very difficult to enforce. Doctors and druggists who could prescribe whiskey for medicinal purposes found themselves inundated with requests. In the 1920s, organized crime and gangsters like Al Capone would capitalize on the persistent demand for liquor, making fortunes in the illegal trade. A lack of enforcement, compounded by an overwhelming desire by the public to obtain alcohol at all costs, eventually resulted in the repeal of the law in 1933. The First World War also provided the impetus for another long-standing goal of some reformers, universal suffrage. Supporters of equal rights for women pointed to Wilson's rallying cry of a war to make the world safe for democracy as hypocritical, saying he was sending American boys to die for such principles while simultaneously denying American women their democratic right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Movement, capitalized on the growing patriotic fervor to point out that every woman who gained the vote could exercise that right in a show of loyalty to the nation, thus offsetting the dangers of draft dodgers or naturalized Germans who already had the right to vote. Alice Paul, of the National Women's Party, used more radical tactics to bring national attention to the issue of women's suffrage, such as organizing protests outside the White House and, later, hunger strikes among arrested protesters. Due to their lack of inclusion in the white-dominated suffrage movement, black suffragists formed the National Association of Colored Women Clubs. Its most prominent leaders, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin and Mary Church Terrell, led the organization in its efforts for women's rights. They also sought to end lynchings and raised money for social services, such as orphanages and homes for the elderly. The NACWC did not always align with the NAWSA, even though they were moving toward the same general goals. By the end of the war, the abusive treatment of suffragist hunger strikers in prison, women's important contribution to the war effort, and the arguments of his suffragist daughter Jessie Woodrow Wilson Sayre moved President Wilson to understand women's right to vote as an ethical mandate for a true democracy. He began urging congressmen and senators to adopt the legislation. The amendment required 36 states to ratify, and by August 1920, 35 states had done so. Tennessee was next to vote to ratify the amendment, and the most likely state remaining to support the measure. As the Tennessee General Assembly convened, members wore a rose pinned on their lapel with its color symbolizing their intended vote, with red for anti-suffrage votes and yellow for the amendment's supporters. As the votes were counted, it was a tie. A second vote confirmed the equal split. The voting rights of 27 million women in the United States then came down to a single vote. The primary argument in the opposition of the vote involved race. Especially in the southern states, the fear was that if black women were able to vote alongside black men, they could disrupt the power structure upholding segregation. During the third vote, 24-year-old Harry T. Byrne, after reading a note from his mother, changed his vote to support the measure. 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention helped launch the suffrage movement, the amendment passed. The 19th Amendment prohibits all efforts to deny the right to vote on the basis of sex. It took effect in time for American women to vote in the presidential election of 1920. Despite this success, the fight for women's rights continued throughout the 20th century, with black Americans often unable to exercise their right to vote, an issue that would lead to the civil rights movement. Issues surrounding the equality of women in society would reemerge in the 1960s in a second wave of efforts focused on reproduction, equal pay, and legal protections. Despite gains, another generation of women led a third wave of feminism in the 1990s, focused on removing the challenges faced by women of color.
(23.4) From War to Peace. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the role that the United States played at the end of World War I. Describe Woodrow Wilson's vision for the post-war world. Explain why the United States never formally approved the Treaty of Versailles nor joined the League of Nations.
The American role in World War I was brief but decisive. While millions of soldiers went overseas and many thousands paid with their lives, the country's involvement was limited to the very end of the war. In fact, the peace process, with the international conference and subsequent ratification process, took longer than the time U.S. soldiers were in country in France. For the Allies, American reinforcements came at a decisive moment in their defense of the Western Front, where a final offensive had exhausted German forces. For the United States, and for Wilson's vision of a peaceful future, the fighting was faster and more successful than what was to follow. Winning the war. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, the Allied forces were close to exhaustion. Great Britain and France had already indebted themselves heavily in the procurement of vital American military supplies. Now, facing a possible defeat, a British delegation to Washington, D.C. requested immediate troop reinforcements to boost Allied spirits and help crush German fighting morale, which was already weakened by short supplies on the front lines and hunger on the home front. Wilson agreed and immediately sent 200,000 American troops in June 1917. These soldiers were placed in quiet zones while they trained and prepared for combat. By March 1918, the Germans had won the war on the Eastern Front. The Russian Revolution of the previous year had not only toppled the hated regime of Tsar Nicholas II, but also ushered in a civil war from which the Bolshevik faction of communist revolutionaries, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, emerged victorious. Weakened by war and internal strife, and eager to build a new Soviet Union, Russian delegates agreed to a generous peace treaty with Germany. Thus emboldened, Germany quickly moved upon the Allied lines, causing both the French and British to ask Wilson to forestall extensive training to U.S. troops, and instead commit them to the front immediately. Although wary of the move, Wilson complied, ordering the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, General John "Blackjack" Pershing, to offer U.S. troops as replacements for the Allied units in need of relief. By May 1918, Americans were fully engaged in the war. In a series of battles along the front that took place from May 28 through August 6, 1918, including the battles of Cantigny, Château-Thierry, Belleau Wood, and the Second Battle of the Marne, American forces alongside the British and French armies succeeded in repelling the German offensive. The Battle of Cantigny on May 28 was the first American offensive in the war. In less than 2 hours that morning, American troops overran the German headquarters in the village, thus convincing the French commanders of their ability to fight against the German line advancing towards Paris. The subsequent battles of Château Thierry and Belleau Wood proved to be the bloodiest of the war for American troops. At the latter, faced with a German onslaught of mustard gas, artillery fire, and mortar fire, U.S. Marines attacked German units in the woods on 6 occasions, at times meeting them in hand-to-hand and bayonet combat, before finally repelling the advance. The U.S. forces suffered 10,000 casualties in the 3-week battle, with almost 2,000 killed in total and 1,087 on a single day. Brutal as they were, they amounted to small losses compared to the casualties suffered by France and Great Britain. Still, these summer battles turned the tide of the war, with the Germans in full retreat by the end of July 1918. By the end of September 1918, over 1 million U.S. soldiers staged a full offensive into the Argonne Forest. By November, after nearly 40 days of intense fighting, the German lines were broken, and their military command reported to German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II of the desperate need to end the war and enter into peace negotiations. Facing civil unrest from the German people in Berlin, as well as the loss of support from his military high command, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated his throne on November 9, 1918, and immediately fled by train to the Netherlands. 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, Germany and the Allies declared an immediate armistice, thus bringing the fighting to a stop and signaling the beginning of the peace process. When the armistice was declared, a total of 117,000 American soldiers had been killed and 206,000 wounded. The Allies as a whole suffered over 5.7 million military deaths, primarily Russian, British, and French men. The Central Powers suffered 4 million military deaths, with half of them German soldiers. The total cost of the war to the United States alone was in excess of $32 billion, with interest expenses and veterans' benefits eventually bringing the cost to well over $100 billion. Economically, emotionally, and geopolitically, the war had taken an enormous toll.
My story. Sergeant Charles Leon Boucher. Life and death in the trenches of France. Wounded in his shoulder by enemy forces, George, a machine gunner posted on the right end of the American platoon, was taken prisoner at the Battle of Seicheprey in 1918. However, as darkness set in that evening, another American soldier, Charlie, heard a noise from a gully beside the trench in which he had hunkered down. "I figured it must be the enemy mop-up patrol," Charlie later said.
I only had a couple of bullets left in the chamber of my .45. The noise stopped, and a head popped into sight. When I was about to fire, I gave another look, and a white and distorted face proved to be that of George, so I grabbed his shoulders and pulled him down into our trench beside me. He must have had about 20 bullet holes in him, but not one of them was well placed enough to kill him. He made an effort to speak, so I told him to keep quiet and conserve his energy. I had a few malted milk tablets left, and I forced them into his mouth. I also poured the last of the water I had left in my canteen into his mouth.
Following a harrowing night, they began to crawl along the road back to their platoon. As they crawled, George explained how he survived being captured. Charlie later told how George
was taken to an enemy first aid station where his wounds were dressed. Then the doctor motioned to have him taken to the rear of their lines. But the sergeant major pushed him towards our side, in no man's land, pulled out his Luger automatic, and shot him down. Then he began to crawl towards our lines, little by little, being shot at consistently by the enemy snipers, till finally he arrived in our position.
The story of Charlie and George, related later in life by Sergeant Charles Leon Boucher to his grandson, was one replayed many times over in various forms during the American Expeditionary Force's involvement in World War I. The industrial scale of death and destruction was as new to American soldiers as to their European counterparts, and the survivors brought home physical and psychological scars that influenced the United States long after the war was won.
The battle for peace. While Wilson had been loath to involve the United States in the war, he saw the country's eventual participation as justification for America's involvement in developing a moral foreign policy for the entire world. The New World Order he wished to create from the outset of his presidency was now within his grasp. The United States emerged from the war as the predominant world power. Wilson sought to capitalize on that influence and impose his moral foreign policy on all the nations of the world. The Paris Peace Conference. As early as January 1918, a full 5 months before U.S. military forces fired their first shot in the war, and 11 months before the actual armistice, Wilson announced his post-war peace plan before a joint session of Congress. Referring to what became known as the 14 Points, Wilson called for openness in all matters of diplomacy and trade, specifically free trade, freedom of the seas, an end to secret treaties and negotiations, promotion of self-determination of all nations, and more. In addition, he called for the creation of a League of Nations to promote the New World Order and preserve territorial integrity through open discussions in place of intimidation and war. As the war concluded, Wilson announced, to the surprise of many, that he would attend the Paris Peace Conference himself, rather than ceding to the tradition of sending professional diplomats to represent the country. His decision influenced other nations to follow suit, and the Paris Conference became the largest meeting of world leaders to date in history. For 6 months, beginning in December 1918, Wilson remained in Paris to personally conduct peace negotiations. Although the French public greeted Wilson with overwhelming enthusiasm, other delegates at the conference had deep misgivings about the American president's plans for a peace without victory. Specifically, Great Britain, France, and Italy sought to obtain some measure of revenge against Germany for drawing them into the war, to secure themselves against possible future aggressions from that nation, and also to maintain or even strengthen their own colonial possessions. Great Britain and France, in particular, sought substantial monetary reparations as well as territorial gains at Germany's expense. Japan also desired concessions in Asia, whereas Italy sought new territory in Europe. Finally, the threat posed by a Bolshevik Russia under Vladimir Lenin, and more importantly, the danger of revolutions elsewhere, further spurred on these allies to use the treaty negotiations to expand their territories and secure their strategic interests, rather than strive towards world peace. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles that officially concluded World War I resembled little of Wilson's original 14 points. The Japanese, French, and British succeeded in carving up many of Germany's colonial holdings in Africa and Asia. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire created new nations under the quasi-colonial rule of France and Great Britain, such as Iraq and Palestine. France gained much of the disputed territory along their border with Germany, as well as passage of a war guilt clause that demanded Germany take public responsibility for starting and prosecuting the war that led to so much death and destruction. Great Britain led the charge that resulted in Germany agreeing to pay reparations in excess of $33 billion to the Allies. As for Bolshevik Russia, Wilson had agreed to send American troops to their northern region to protect Allied supplies and holdings there, while also participating in an economic blockade designed to undermine Lenin's power. This move would ultimately have the opposite effect of galvanizing popular support for the Bolsheviks. The sole piece of the original 14 points that Wilson successfully fought to keep intact was the creation of a League of Nations. At a covenant agreed to at the conference, all member nations in the League would agree to defend all other member nations against military threats. Known as Article 10, this agreement would basically render each nation equal in terms of power, as no member nation would be able to use its military might against a weaker member nation. Ironically, this article would prove to be the undoing of Wilson's dream of a new world order. Ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. Although the other nations agreed to the final terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson's greatest battle lay in the ratification debate that awaited him upon his return. As with all treaties, this one would require 2/3 approval by the U.S. Senate for final ratification, something Wilson knew would be difficult to achieve. Even before Wilson's return to Washington, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that oversaw ratification proceedings, issued a list of 14 reservations he had regarding the treaty, most of which centered on the creation of a League of Nations. An isolationist in foreign policy issues, Lodge feared that Article 10 would require extensive American intervention, as more countries would seek her protection in all controversial affairs. But on the other side of the political spectrum, interventionists argued that Article 10 would impede the United States from using her rightfully attained military power to secure and protect America's international interests. Wilson's greatest fight was with the Senate, where most Republicans opposed the treaty due to the clauses surrounding the creation of the League of Nations. Some Republicans, known as irreconcilables, opposed the treaty on all grounds, whereas others, called reservationists, would support the treaty if sufficient amendments were introduced that could eliminate Article 10. In an effort to turn public support into a weapon against those in opposition, Wilson embarked on a cross-country railway speaking tour. He began traveling in September 1919, and the grueling pace, after the stress of the 6 months in Paris, proved too much. Wilson fainted following a public event on September 25, 1919, and immediately returned to Washington. There he suffered a debilitating stroke, leaving his second wife, Edith Wilson, in charge as de facto president for a period of about 6 months. Frustrated that his dream of a new world order was slipping away, a frustration that was compounded by the fact that, now an invalid, he was unable to speak his own thoughts coherently, Wilson urged Democrats in the Senate to reject any effort to compromise on the treaty. As a result, Congress voted on and defeated the originally worded treaty in November. When the treaty was introduced with reservations, or amendments, in March 1920, it again fell short of the necessary margin for ratification. As a result, the United States never became an official signatory of the Treaty of Versailles, nor did the country join the League of Nations, which shattered the international authority and significance of the organization. Although Wilson received the Nobel Peace Prize in October 1919 for his efforts to create a model of world peace, he remained personally embarrassed and angry at his country's refusal to be a part of that model. As a result of its rejection of the treaty, the United States technically remained at war with Germany until July 21, 1921, when it formally came to a close with Congress's quiet passage of the Knox-Porter Resolution.
(23.5) Demobilization and its difficult aftermath. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the challenges that the United States faced following the conclusion of World War I. Explain Warren G. Harding's landslide victory in the 1920 presidential election.
As world leaders debated the terms of the peace, the American public faced its own challenges at the conclusion of the First World War. Several unrelated factors intersected to create a chaotic and difficult time, just as massive numbers of troops rapidly demobilized and came home. Racial tensions, a terrifying flu epidemic, anti-communist hysteria, and economic uncertainty all combined to leave many Americans wondering what exactly they had won in the war. Adding to these problems was the absence of President Wilson, who remained in Paris for 6 months, leaving the country leaderless. The result of these factors was that, rather than a celebratory transition from wartime to peace and prosperity, and ultimately the jazz age of the 1920s, 1919 was a tumultuous year that threatened to tear the country apart. Disorder and fear in America. After the war ended, U.S. troops were demobilized and rapidly sent home. One unanticipated and unwanted effect of their return was the emergence of a new strain of influenza that medical professionals had never before encountered. Within months of the war's end, over 20 million Americans fell ill from the flu. Eventually, 675,000 Americans died before the disease mysteriously ran its course in the spring of 1919. Worldwide, recent estimates suggest that 500 million people suffered from this flu strain, with as many as 50 million people dying. Throughout the United States, from the fall of 1918 to the spring of 1919, fear of the flu gripped the country. Americans avoided public gatherings, children wore surgical masks to school, and undertakers ran out of coffins and burial plots in cemeteries. Hysteria grew as well, and instead of welcoming soldiers home with a post-war celebration, people hunkered down and hoped to avoid contagion. Another element that greatly influenced the challenges of immediate post-war life was economic upheaval. As discussed above, wartime production had led to steady inflation. The rising cost of living meant that few Americans could comfortably afford to live off their wages. When the government's wartime control over the economy ended, businesses slowly recalibrated from the wartime production of guns and ships to the peacetime production of toasters and cars. Public demand quickly outpaced the slow production, leading to notable shortages of domestic goods. As a result, inflation skyrocketed in 1919. By the end of the year, the cost of living in the United States was nearly double what it had been in 1916. Workers, facing a shortage in wages to buy more expensive goods, and no longer bound by the no-strike pledge they made for the National War Labor Board, initiated a series of strikes for better hours and wages. In 1919 alone, more than 4 million workers participated in a total of nearly 3,000 strikes, both records within all of American history. In addition to labor clashes, race riots shattered the peace at the home front. The race riots that had begun during the Great Migration only grew in post-war America. White soldiers returned home to find black workers in their former jobs and neighborhoods, and were committed to restoring their position of white supremacy. Black soldiers returned home with a renewed sense of justice and strength, and were determined to assert their rights as men and as citizens. Meanwhile, Southern lynchings continued to escalate, with white mobs burning African Americans at the stake. The mobs often used false accusations of indecency and assault on white women to justify the murders. During the Red Summer of 1919, northern cities recorded 25 bloody race riots that killed over 250 people. Among these was the Chicago race riot of 1919, where a white mob stoned a young black boy to death because he swam too close to the white beach on Lake Michigan. Police at the scene did not arrest the perpetrator who threw the rock. This crime prompted a week-long riot that left 23 black people and 15 white people dead, as well as millions of dollars worth of damage to the city. A massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921 turned out even more deadly, with estimates of black fatalities ranging from 50 to 300. Again, the violence arose based on a dubious allegation of assault on a white girl by a black teenager. After an incendiary newspaper article, a conflict at the courthouse led to 10 white and 2 black people's deaths. A riot ensued, with white groups pursuing black people as they retreated to the Greenwood section of the city. Both sides were armed, and gunfire and arson continued throughout the night. The next morning, the white groups began an assault on the black neighborhoods, killing many black residents and destroying homes and businesses. The Tulsa Massacre, also called the Tulsa Riot, Greenwood Massacre, or Black Wall Street Massacre, was widely reported at the time, but was omitted from many historical recollections, textbooks, and media for decades. While illness, economic hardship, and racial tensions all came from within, another destabilizing factor arrived from overseas. As revolutionary rhetoric emanating from Bolshevik Russia intensified in 1918 and 1919, a Red Scare erupted in the United States over fear that communist infiltrators sought to overthrow the American government as part of an international revolution. When investigators uncovered a collection of 36 letter bombs at a New York City post office, with recipients that included several federal, state, and local public officials, as well as industrial leaders such as John D. Rockefeller, fears grew significantly. And when 8 additional bombs actually exploded simultaneously on June 2, 1919, including one that destroyed the entrance to U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's house in Washington, the country was convinced that all radicals, no matter what ilk, were to blame. Socialists, communists, members of the industrial workers of the world, wobblies, and anarchists. They were all threats to be taken down. Private citizens who considered themselves upstanding and loyal Americans, joined by discharged soldiers and sailors, raided radical meeting houses in many major cities, attacking any alleged radicals they found inside. By November 1919, Palmer's new assistant in charge of the Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, organized nationwide raids on radical headquarters in 12 cities around the country. Subsequent Palmer raids resulted in the arrests of 4,000 alleged American radicals who were detained for weeks in overcrowded cells. Almost 250 of those arrested were subsequently deported on board a ship dubbed the Soviet Ark.
My story. The Tulsa race riot and 3 of its victims. B.C. Franklin was a prominent black lawyer in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A survivor of the Tulsa massacre, he penned a first-person account 10 years after the events. The manuscript was uncovered in 2015 and has been published by the Smithsonian.
About midnight, I arose and went to the north porch on the second floor of my hotel, and looking in a northwesterly direction, I saw the top of Standpipe Hill literally lighted up by blazes that came from the throats of machine guns, and I could hear bullets whizzing and cutting the air. There was shooting now in every direction, and the sounds that came from the thousands and thousands of guns were deafening. I reached my office in safety, but I knew that safety would be short-lived. I now knew the mob spirit. I knew, too, that government and law and order had broken down. I knew that mob law had been substituted in all its fiendishness and barbarity. I knew that the mobbist cared nothing about the written law and the Constitution, and I also knew that he had neither the patience nor the intelligence to distinguish between the good and the bad, the law-abiding and the lawless in my race. From my office window, I could see planes circling in mid-air. They grew in number and hummed, darted, and dipped low. I could hear something like hail falling upon the top of my office building. Down East Archer, I saw the old Midway Hotel on fire, burning from its top, and then another and another and another building began to burn from the top.
A return to normalcy? By 1920, Americans had failed their great expectations to make the world safer and more democratic. The flu epidemic had demonstrated the limits of science and technology in making Americans less vulnerable. The Red Scare signified Americans' fear of revolutionary politics and the persistence of violent capital-labor conflicts. And race riots made it clear that the nation was no closer to peaceful race relations either. After a long era of progressive initiatives and new government agencies, followed by a costly war that did not end in a better world, most of the public sought to focus on economic progress and success in their private lives instead. As the presidential election of 1920 unfolded, the extent of just how tired Americans were of an interventionist government whether in terms of progressive reform or international involvement, became exceedingly clear. Republicans, anxious to return to the White House after 8 years of Wilson idealism, capitalized on this growing American sentiment to find the candidate who would promise a return to normalcy. The Republicans found their man in Senator Warren G. Harding from Ohio. Although not the most energetic candidate for the White House, Harding offered what party handlers desired: a candidate around whom they could mold their policies of low taxes, immigration restriction, and non-interference in world affairs. He also provided Americans with what they desired: a candidate who could look and act presidential, and yet leave them alone to live their lives as they wished. Democratic leaders realized they had little chance at victory. Wilson remained adamant that the election be a referendum over his League of Nations, yet after his stroke, he was in no physical condition to run for a third term. Political infighting among his cabinet, most notably between A. Mitchell Palmer and William McAdoo, threatened to split the party convention until a compromise candidate could be found in Ohio, Governor James Cox. Cox chose, for his vice presidential running mate, the young Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At a time when Americans wanted prosperity and normalcy, rather than continued interference in their lives, Harding won in an overwhelming landslide, with 404 votes to 127 in the Electoral College and 60% of the popular vote. With the war, the flu epidemic, the Red Scare, and other issues behind them, Americans looked forward to Harding's inauguration in 1921 and to an era of personal freedoms and hedonism that would come to be known as the Jazz Age.
Defining American, historical amnesia and cultural memory. The Tulsa Massacre shocked the nation in large part because it was widely reported. The day after, the New York Times front page read, "85 whites and Negroes die in Tulsa riots," a headline echoed by dozens of other newspapers, including international publications. Editorials and commentary from every region of the country criticized the acts as shameful, criminal, and disgraceful. The same acknowledgement and criticism followed other race riots and lynchings. However, most Americans stopped talking about these events soon after, and they faded from memory. According to the Tulsa Massacre Report, commissioned by the state of Oklahoma and released in 2001, school curricula, textbooks, and news organizations throughout the 1930s through the 1950s and 1960s either avoided mentioning the riot entirely or offered highly sanitized versions. For many Americans, the Tulsa Massacre would remain largely unknown until it was depicted in other media, such the opening scenes of the television series Watchmen in 2019. Such historical amnesia is typically viewed as a combination of deliberate actions, such as eliminating facts and events from retellings of history, to more everyday avoidance of discussion because of discomfort or shame. The treatment of enslaved people and Native Americans has been subject to similar amnesia, as have been events in other countries such as the British treatment of Indian people during the colonial period and war crimes committed by dozens of countries. In contrast, groups can maintain cultural memory shaped by momentous events as well as shared traumas. This memory can be a significant component of cultural and societal identity, becoming part of a shared heritage. The Tulsa Massacre Report, for example, discusses the efforts of many Tulsa residents, including Black people and white people, who worked to preserve history by collecting and sharing first-person accounts, official hospital and Red Cross records, and photographs from before and after the riot. Read more about the Tulsa Massacre and the contrasting efforts to forget and remember it in the Tulsa Massacre Report. Which events have occurred in your lifetime that you feel are unexpectedly or inappropriately forgotten?
This has been U.S. History from OpenStax. OpenStax textbooks and this free audiobook are covered under a Creative Commons license. The full text is available at www.openstax.org. This project was made possible by CC ECHO, the California Consortium for Equitable Change in Hispanic-Serving Institutions, Open Education Resources. You can learn more about CC ECHO by visiting the link in this episode's show notes. You can find this audiobook anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and more. Instructors can even download a course shell to embed these recordings in Canvas courses. Learn more by visiting www.openaudio.us. Did you find this audiobook helpful? If so, let us know by leaving a comment and sharing this recording with a colleague or a friend.